as was said, I'm going to read a little bit from my novel, The Devil in Silver. But more importantly, I thought the pleasure of sort of doing an event like this is that you get to read, but also like just talk with the audience a bit and make it a bit more personal than the usual reading necessarily allows for. So what I'd like to do is sort of go back and forth, explain a little bit of how aspects of the book came to be, and then reading a little bit from one chapter in particular. So to begin with, I would say this novel began about 2012? So about 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago, my wife and I were living in Amsterdam. I got a fellowship, and we were living out there for about 6 months. And one of the things that we did, which is that you're encouraged to do, is go to the museums in Amsterdam. They're amazing. There's so many amazing museums, but one in particular is the Van Gogh Museum, which is of course dedicated to Vincent Van Gogh. And so we made a couple of trips to that museum in particular, and what's great about that museum is they have the paintings sort of, you come in and they're sort of set up in a timeline, up like 3 or 4 floors. And what you do is when you walk in on the first floor, you basically walk through all these paintings that were inspirational to Van Gogh when he was young. Not necessarily famous paintings, but ones that meant something to him. And as you go up the flights, they set it up so you see his early work, and then you keep going and going until you get toward, on the 3rd floor, at the very end, you get toward the work that we think of now as Van Gogh's great work. And in particular, as you move toward the very end, you almost believe you can read the mood of Van Gogh changing. You can see him going from an apprentice to a craftsperson to a master. And then slowly you see that, you know, those colors we're used to, those vibrant, rich tones, and that sort of, just that gorgeous way of Van Gogh, it starts to sort of slip away and become sort of, the tones become more muted, and everything sort of gets gray. And at the very end, you see one of his very last paintings, Wheat Field with Crows. And you can, even if you didn't know what his life trajectory was, you could kind of guess from following this path. And I thought it was such a brilliant way to make you care, not just about individual paintings, but about the person who lived these paintings, who lived and made these paintings. And so after we'd gone a couple times, I started reading his letters, and was sort of obsessively reading his letters. And the more I read, the more Van Gogh became a sort of patron saint to the book that I was starting to think about, which was this book. And there are a variety of reasons why he became a patron saint to this book, but truest above all was that when he talked about what he was trying to do when he painted these paintings, when he really hit his stride, he said that he was trying to write a love letter to humanity. That's what he was doing with his work. And I thought that was such a beautiful and profound idea that it really inspired me. And so what I'd like to do is read one, I'm going to go on and off reading from this one chapter in The Devil in Silver that is essentially just my version of the biography of Vincent Van Gogh. So here we go. Vincent Van Gogh was born in Groot Zundert, Holland in 1853 to Theodorus and Anna Van Gogh. The pair had 3 boys and 3 girls, and Vincent was the oldest. Their father, Theodorus, was a well-liked, respected, but not terribly gifted preacher. Anna cared for the family and was also greatly loved. In 1869, at 16, Vincent went to work at an art dealership, which had ties to his uncle and namesake, Vincent. Young Vincent was being groomed to join the trade. He worked with them in The Hague. In 1873, he moved to their offices in London. There, he roomed with a mother and daughter. He felt hard for the daughter, Ursula. Ursula bumped him back, though. She was already engaged to another man, but Vincent was a sensitive dude, and he took the news hard. Went into a depression and found solace in a deeper sense of religious faith. He also stopped rooming with Ursula and her mother. Considering the general trajectory of Vincent's adult life, this is about the most sensible thing he ever did. He left Ursula's home, but she hadn't left his heart. The man was depressed. So much so that his family worried and had him transferred to the Paris branch of the art dealership. But this only compounded his pain, and Vincent worked less and less well. Instead, he spent all his free time holed up reading the Bible with a friend. And in 1876, 23-year-old Vincent was fired from the art dealers. His family had suggestions for what he should do next. They were a close bunch. He could open his own shop, become a painter. His closest sibling and greatest friend, Theo, suggested this. But Vincent decided to return to London to become a teacher. Vincent got work at 2 different schools as a kind of curate, assisting the head of each institution, but he didn't last long there. Pretty quickly, his uncle lined up a job at a bookshop. Vincent was a terrific reader his entire life, but wasn't enthusiastic about the bookstore. At 24, Vincent switched gears again and decided to study theology. Some family members supported him in this plan, but others, like Uncle Vincent, were sick of his shit. The theology degree demanded 7 years of study. There was some question as to whether Vincent had the seriousness, the fortitude, to concentrate on the subject for so long. Did he? No. Vincent stayed for only a year. He hated studying grammar and doing writing exercises. He didn't want to be an academic. He wanted to bring good cheer to the Gospels. That's it. Pretty soon his tutor agreed that Vincent was not cut out for theology school. Instead, Vincent decided to become an evangelist in Belgium. This only required a certificate of study, no Latin or Greek, only 3 months of work at the School of Evangelization in Brussels. Around this time, Vincent's parents wrote in a letter, quote, that he deliberately chooses the most difficult path. Back at the evangelical school, it turned out that Vincent was a lousy student. He dressed strangely, meaning he didn't pay much attention to his clothes and their care. He couldn't speak off the cuff, so he had to prepare all his remarks and read from the pages, and he didn't even do that very well. And worst of all, for the school's purposes, he wasn't submissive. He argued with the school's leaders, didn't do exactly as told. When his 3 months of training were up, they refused to give him a position anywhere. Much as he dealt with the aftermath of Ursula, Vincent took his failure at school pretty hard. He didn't eat, didn't sleep, got thin and weak. He was in a constant nervous state. This is around the first time that people close to him began to notice his humor and constitution. To put it bluntly, they thought the boy was a little off. Vincent's father came to Brussels to see him and used his influence to get Vincent a trial appointment in Wasmus, a small coal mining town, for 6 months. He would get a very small salary, but he didn't get to give Bible lectures, teach children, and visit the sick, the things he actually wanted to do. He worked with the people of the mining town, but after 6 months, his job wasn't renewed, and Vincent left town on foot, which would become a pretty standard method for him since he never had money to pay for trains. Time passed after the loss of the job, and Vincent lost his religious zeal. He fell into a funk and isolated himself. Theo and his parents started sending Vincent money just so he could eat, have a place to stay, that kind of stuff, but it wasn't much and wasn't regular. Around this time, Vincent made pilgrimages to the studio of an artist he greatly admired named Jules Breton. He walked all the way to Breton's place in another town and was so intimidated and so ashamed of himself that he just turned right back around and walked all the way home. Along the way, Vincent slept in haylofts or outdoors. He'd begun doing some art of his own, and he traded drawings for bread when he could, but his health deteriorated. Finally, around 1880, Vincent declared himself a painter. He rented a room in a miner's home. Vincent shared the room with the miner's children. This was his first studio. He drew the miners going to and from work. Sometimes he worked out in the garden, but in October of 1880, he moved to Brussels again to work in a small hotel. He needed the money, but he also wanted to meet other artists, and Brussels offered more chances than the mining town. He wanted some camaraderie. So, so if we fast forward now to, that must have been 2009 when we were in Amsterdam, I'm sorry. Fast forward a year, my wife and I were back in New York City, and on May 21st, 2010, she gave birth to our first child, a little boy named Geronimo, and who is great. And no, I'm just kidding. I'm not begging for that yet. But the reality of him being born just as the summer was beginning, and the reality was he was just born, and both my wife is a writer as well, and both of us had books that were due for contract at the end of the summer, September 1st. So we had a sort of agreement going. We said, like, okay, for the length of the summer, since we were off from teaching, each of us would get 2 hours out of the house to go write. Well, to go do whatever, sometimes to just be away from spouse and baby, but also to write, you know. But because of that short distance, it meant if we really wanted to write, it means we couldn't go very far. And so my wife found a little cafe like a block away, and I found the Dunkin' Donuts on 179th Street in Broadway. Originally, I found the Twin Donuts on 180th in Broadway, but it's very small, and even though it was empty, they would do this thing. I would set up my computer. You know, no one is there, so what's the difference? And I'm buying coffee and donuts. But like after 30 minutes, they would come by and say, "Oh, we have to sweep right here. I'm very sorry. Oh, we have to wipe down the table right now." You know, and so I finally accepted, like, okay, you don't even want my regular coffee refill money. And so I jetted down to the Dunkin' Donuts, which was much bigger, and I could just sort of like disappear against one of the stalls by the window and work there freely for my 2 hours, you know, or an hour and 50 minutes. So that's where I wrote this book for the most part. And what was great about working there was that I got to see all these, every kind of humanity came through the door of the Dunkin' Donuts, because it's also right next to 180th Street branch of the Port Authority, the George Washington Bridge Port Authority. And I don't know if you've ever been to that Port Authority, but it's rough. Even the 42nd Street branch does not seem as rough as the George Washington branch. And you know, so tourists would come in through there, folks trading pharmaceutical drugs at really low prices with each other, homeless folks, old folks who were just hanging out for the day. Everybody was there, but what was great about it was, like, I just got to see this cross-section of humanity and basically steal their voices and the looks of them for the book, one way or the other. But what also happened at this time was we had a lot of people very close to us coming to help us out over that summer. My wife's family, my family, her best friend came over and just brought us like all these cartons of red bean soup. You know, all these that we just put in the freezer, and she would just microwave, because I know you can't cook right now, blah, blah, blah. And I was kind of struck by the, both at the Dunkin' Donuts and from these people close to us, by the broad and beautiful collage that is humanity. You know, at least that's how I took it, because I was in a good mood because of my son. Okay, and I know I'm going to keep reading. In 1881, Vincent moved back in with his parents. He had a good run with them, but over the summer he met an older cousin, Key. Key was grieving over the loss of her husband and raising a 4-year-old boy on her own. Vincent fell for her, but she rejected him. Guess how Vincent reacted? Yep. This time he flipped out even harder. He didn't just go into a depression, he became irritable and unstable and pushed at this cousin, trying to win her over. It got so bad the whole family was just embarrassed. Vincent had a really bad fight with his father over the matter and finally moved out. He returned to The Hague and lived there for 2 years. While he was there, he met a new woman. She was poor, rough, a heavy drinker, a fighter, and smallpox survivor. Also, possibly a prostitute. In other words, Vincent hooked up with a hood rat. And all the fine friends and family members got pissy about this. They told him this woman wasn't proper for him, and in truth, Vincent and this woman don't sound like they were actually in love. Vincent had always wanted to do good, to help, and had failed at it again and again. This woman, admittedly only from Vincent's account, was having a hard time supporting herself and her son. If Vincent wants to offer companionship and nominal financial support, why would she ever say no? So they stayed together, but it didn't last. Vincent still spent most of his money on art supplies and not on the new family. Also, Vincent was a bit judgmental himself. He kept trying to change her ways. Eventually, they parted. In 1883, Vincent, despondent, returned to his parents' home. He lived with them for 2 more years. He argued with them a lot. Folks give credit to Vincent's brother Theo, but Anna and Theodorus were wonderful to him, considering what a dick he could be. In 1884, Vincent's mother suffered a fall and broke her leg, and Vincent, to everyone's great happiness, turned out to be a loving and attentive caretaker for her while she healed up. Good feeling returned to his relationship with his parents, and that's Vincent all over, utterly selfish and magnificently selfless, all one or all the other, depending on the day. While he was still with his parents, Vincent got one more chance at romance, this time with a neighbor's daughter. Maybe they weren't in love, but they seemed to enjoy each other's company, which is a hell of a lot of happiness sometimes. But the neighbor's family refused to accept the union. The daughter, in her despair, tried to commit suicide. She lived. Their relationship was over, and Vincent seemed to lose hope entirely for that kind of pleasure in his life. Pleasure meaning love, because he visited prostitutes plenty over the years. So, no love, but during this time, Vincent had been working constantly. He sketched and painted with fervor. The early stuff, like most early stuff, wasn't great, but the man hoped that he could produce worthwhile art eventually. From letter number 106, from his letters, "Oh, Theo boy, if I might only succeed in this, if that healthy depression, because everything I undertook failed, that torrent of reproaches which I have heard and felt, if it might be taken from me, and if there might be given to me both the opportunity and strength needed to come to full development and to persevere in that course for which my father and I would thank the Lord so fervently." All right. So I'm going to stop there for a minute. So as I was working on this book at the Dunkin' Donuts, drinking in all the humanity around me, I found that I tried to write this book in a number of different ways, in a number of different genres. I tried to write it at first as a horror novel, because I love horror novels, and a straight horror novel, I mean. And then I tried to write it as a work of political fiction, because I love those too. I tried to write it even as like long-form journalism, as a series of biographies of people, and as a black comedy, and even as an expose of the problems with the American healthcare system, particularly how the mentally ill are treated. But all of them failed. As I got 10, 20, 50 pages in, no one method was the right method for writing the story, I found. And so, after a number of sort of stops and starts and frustrations, I finally just decided that any and every direction I had to take for the betterment of the book and for the telling of the story that this book needed to be, I would just take. And so for the times when it needed to be a horror story, it was just going to be a horror story. And when I needed to just cram in I used real live news accounts from like the New York Times and various places, just to say, because I felt like people might say, you know, if you've ever experienced something hard, whether it's someone suffering from an illness or what a pain in the ass it can be to get your insurance to pay back after you've had a flood. Anyone who has not experienced this thing will never believe how impossibly fatalistic it can make you, and how crazy it can all be. Because as human beings, we like to think that systems work, and the systems we live in work. So what I found was, as the story was continuing, I had to occasionally just break in and just include real newspaper articles to just say to you, as bad as I'm describing the healthcare system, it's worse, but I don't want to depress the hell out of you. So here's a moment where you'll be depressed, and then let's get back to the story, and let's have a few jokes, because that was sad. And then I'd move to something else, and then I'd have my long political tract, and then I'd have an essay in the middle. And my idea was just like, this thing has to be the book it needs to be, rather than just the single thing that would be the easiest way to write it, because I would have to lose too much else in order to keep it together. In a way, for me, Van Gogh became a great model, because he did much the same thing. As I said, like when you see him on the first floor of the museum, on the second floor of the museum, you just see him trying and fail, all these different styles. And you know, what I reminded myself was, you see him trying and failing, and obviously not giving up. But you also see him trying and failing and then switching. But when he switches, you can see the things that he took from that failed attempt. You can see the way that he was obsessed with painting the common people, like the coal miners he lived. And while later on, his work didn't look like those early places where he was doing this sort of, not photorealist, that wouldn't be right, but these darkened, smudge-like paintings of their interior lives. The later paintings were still of people who were putting together hay bales, things like that. It was still the people. He brought that with him, but he just changed the method, you know. And that stayed with me, this idea that all these things can come together one after the next to make your work into something complete and total. And you just try and fail until you hit it. All right, so now I'm going to be the end of Vincent Champion. In 1885, Vincent's father died. After a long walk, right at the threshold of his home, Vincent moved out of his mother's home and went off painting people and scenes from the world around him. During this time, he hoped to make a splash, do something great, be noticed, with a painting called The Potato Eaters. It's a dark, sludgy work, aping the style generally respected in the day. It didn't make him famous, it didn't sell, and for good reason, it stinks. In 1886, Vincent moved to Paris and lived with his brother Theo. Theo had joined the family business and worked as an art dealer. This time was good for Vincent. His health improved, and he even had an operation to replace almost all his teeth. Because Vincent had lived on a diet of mostly beer and black bread, literally bread so old it was going black, which was cheaper to buy than fresh bread, the majority of Vincent's teeth had fallen out. You know the reason he's not smiling in those self-portraits? It's not just because of his melancholy soul. It's because the poor bastard was practically toothless. It was a good time for Vincent, but less so for Theo. As Vincent's parents learned, as nearly anyone who ever lived with Vincent learned, Vincent Van Gogh was an asshole. Awful. Even his beloved Theo came to fight and dislike the brother he believed to be an artistic genius. It's also worth noting that all these years, Theo had been sending money to Vincent wherever he was living so he could spend as much time as possible painting and not holding a job. Despite this, Vincent treated Theo much the same as everyone. He was messy, argumentative, and bossy. During all those years they wrote to each other, there was one request Vincent made more than any other: send more money. And Theo did. In 1888, Vincent left Theo. He now hit the creative high point of his life. It would last only 2 years. During that time, he produced thousands of paintings and sketches. Theo worked his butt off to try to sell the stuff, and he failed. Vincent produced, Theo believed, the world shrugged. This period from 1888 on was the time when Vincent did the stuff he became famous for, the romantic round. This was when he roomed with Paul Gauguin, that didn't last, cut off a part of his ear in an absolute frenzy, and presented it as a gift to a local prostitute. She fainted. This was also the time when Vincent began his commitments to mental institutions. In 1889, Vincent's neighbors became tired of him and his antics, and they signed a petition to have him put away, involuntary commitment, 19th century style. Vincent got out, but soon after he committed himself to an asylum in Saint-Denis. He stayed there for a year. While the paintings from 1888 show the style that would make him legendary, rich with color, sensory and explosive, the ones he made in 1889 begin to show another side. The colors became duller here and there. A deep and lasting sadness seemed almost visible on the canvas. In 1890, Vincent returned to Paris, where he visited Theo, who had married a woman named Johanna, the woman who would really take up the mantle of her husband and expose Vincent's genius to the world. There he also met Theo and Johanna's first child, a son named Vincent. In May of 1890, Vincent left Paris. He returned to Auvers so he could paint again. On July 27, 1890, Vincent walked out into a field alone and shot himself in the chest. There have been rumors Vincent was shot by someone else, and Vincent didn't name names, allowed everyone to think his death was pure suicide. Is it true? The evidence is sketchy at best, but the bullet wound is no rumor, nor is its effect. The bullet didn't kill Vincent out in the field, so he dragged himself back to his home. A watch was kept as he lay in agonizing pain. Theo made it to town in time to see his brother still alive. On the morning of July 29th, Vincent died of his wounds. Of course now, over a century later, this end and the death of Theo from a complete breakdown 6 months later is cast as some epic denouement. But imagine the article that might have run then: or now. Maybe the headline would read this way: Drifter commits suicide. But really, something like that wouldn't even be considered news. I'll stop there. Thanks.